Okay, let's continue to reflect on events happening in the Central African nation of Gabon. This is after the military, through a televised address, said that they have seized power. We speak to Tara O'Connor, Director at Africa Risk Consulting. Thank you very much, Tara, for your time this afternoon. Did this really come as a surprise?
Yes, it does, although given in the context of all the military coups that have taken place over the last couple of years in the region, we perhaps should not be surprised. And we shouldn't be surprised for, I think, a couple of reasons. The first being that Ali Ben Bongo, the incumbent, who was the elected and now deposed president, had altered the constitution to allow for an extended term for a third term. And that is extremely unpopular. And it is the sort of excuse that the military in other countries, notably in Guinea, in the region, have given to intervene.
The extension of constitutions on this here continent, just how big of a problem does it present, especially in terms of laying a firm foundation for events such as these? You also take a look closely at the West African nation of Cameroon.
Yes, the lack of the obstacle to putting obstacles to the normal, what the French call alternance, the change of government, change of leader after elections, is held very dearly by the populations of West Africa. And so we've seen in other countries such as Senegal in particular, when the outgoing president Abdoulaye Wade had finished his term, he sought to impose on the country a candidate in the form of his son, Karim Wade, and that proved much too unpopular, sparked loads of protests on the street. We're seeing a similar level of unrest in Senegal, with as Macky Sall, the current incumbent, has hinted that he would seek a further term. So, and obviously, Paul Biya has been in power, I think, since 1987. He's one of the longest-serving leaders in the region, having come to a power himself in a military coup, or post a military coup. So I'm not. So it's the two elements of it are the sort of what I would call dynastic politics, i.e., handing a presidency over to your son or a member of your family is incredibly unpopular. We saw in Burkina Faso, that was one of the reasons for the ousting. That previous instability has led to a family member being put forward as a potential presidential candidate is deeply unpopular. We see that elsewhere in Africa. This is apparently what's going to be happening in Uganda, and I think the similar popular unrest will follow that too.
Deeply unpopular, more so when these dynasties the spoils do not reach the masses. So if we are speaking especially about the return to democratic rule, should we also not be speaking very intimately about the importance of good governance? Because some would argue that, well, you can give us a dictator, you can give us a dynasty, you can give us a monarchy, but make sure that the lives of the people on the ground are just as comfortable, if not more so. You take a look at this oil-rich nation, but the peoples are not feeling it.
Absolutely. I mean, putting it into context, Gabon is a very wealthy country. It's one of Africa's wealthiest countries in terms of GDP per capita, largely because of the oil. It's got a very small population, and it has oil production of about 210 barrels of oil a day, plus a host of other minerals. But yes, you're absolutely right. The wealth and the power in Gabon have been concentrated in the Bongo family almost since independence. And it's, Ali Ben Bongo took over 14 years ago from his father, Omar Bongo, who, and so to a large extent, and they have controlled a lot of the power and the wealth within that family, who are famously very, very wealthy, have properties all over the world, live very much a super elite lifestyle, and rely on trickle down for the rest of the population. So it isn't great. And we see that this, across Africa, you've now got very young, very very connected young people who see what the rest of the world has and how other countries do it, and they are extremely dissatisfied with the fact that governance is so bad, that power and wealth are far too often concentrated in the hands of very few people, and lots of people. There's very high unemployment across the continent, as you know, very high levels of migration across the continent as people seek work and a better life. Some of them, in fact, coming up to Libya and Tunisia and crossing the Mediterranean at great peril. So it is one of the key things but that brings us back to the military intervention. And the real question is whether military intervention now in 5 countries across West Africa is actually going to improve the lot of the population. And history shows us, the history of West Africa's interventions in military interventions in Nigeria, in Ghana, in other countries throughout the 1970s and early 80s shows us that absolutely the opposite. Military intervention actually has the impact of impoverishing people further. And so however popular the intervention may be momentarily by the military in Niger, in Gabon now, and in other countries, the people will feel it. It doesn't improve governance. It's a suspension of the rule of law and the Constitution. And really, it should. I'm hoping that the African Union sticks to its stance, and so does ECOWAS, and opposes these military coups very, very forcefully.
Tara, who needs to do what? You speak of the African Union, ECOWAS opposing these coups, but with all those factors that the pull factors or the push factors that actually leads to coups, does something not need to be done before it even gets to a point where it's so dangerously close to a government being toppled because it is seen not to be doing what needs to be done? Rather, when you take a look at intracontinental movement or migration, it's much higher than what the world makes it out to be, where people are shown to be crossing the Mediterranean. Yes, perilous journeys are being embarked on, but the biggest movement in terms of the displacement of people happens within this here continent. And so who needs to do what before we get to a situation that is desperate?
You're absolutely right. I think the last figures, it's something like 16 million people on the move, at any given time across the continent, moving between countries, again, moving to areas, moving within countries to areas where they're in the hope of jobs, looking for jobs and so on. And yes, so critically, the first thing that has to be done is focus on the economy. And there's a route map for improving Africa's economy, which is out there, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And the faster that, and in fact, the movement of people around the continent is a very good thing, and one that should be encouraged, because obviously people seek jobs, but they also create jobs. If they get into stable economies, you find that migrants are a great injector they inject economic activity in any country where they go and stabilize and so on. So it is incumbent upon governments to do absolutely everything to use some of the poorest taxpayers in the world's money to better educate, to reinforce the rule of law, reinforce democracy, because our continent, the continent of Africa's democracies are still young democracies, sort of, really the shift from the post-independence dictatorship era really only closed out with the Cold War. and we saw it moving into this new democratic era, which is, as we can see, fragile, and made more fragile by the last couple of years of economic disruption with COVID. Africa was very badly affected by the complete severance of the supply chain between the US, with the international world. Africa, the North-South divide became much more acute during COVID. And I think a lot of these governance problems and a lot of the acute political problems that a number of countries are seeing at the moment is the long tail of COVID's economic disruption. So it's critical that economies are relaunched and got back onto an even keel. And in my view, that's better done under democratic and not military rule.
Thank you very much, Tara O'Connor, Director at Africa Risk Consulting.